All right, this is State of Global Forest C. We're going to focus on global forest uses and values in this last part of the lecture. More great data from FAO in terms of forest uses. Some of these statistics come from FAO, another great source. It's important to remember that value that we derive from forests certainly can be economic, but also social and environmental. So, economic is usually things like forest products, that have a dollar value. But certainly we derive environmental benefits, so things like ecosystem services, so, water provision, carbon sequestration. Those are examples of environmental services. But then also social. Recreation maybe is the most obvious one, but aesthetic. There's lots of evolving data showing that forests are important for health. So for instance, neighborhoods with more tree cover tend to be healthier. So lots of values that we derive from forests. So wood, wood is the first thing we think about, at least when foresters think about forests, and forests globally there's a great demand for wood from forests. That demand is growing steadily. So the demand for wood goes up about 1.5% per year. So the demand for wood is steadily growing. An interesting statistic is that about 50% of the wood in the world is used for domestic purposes. So at least here in the West, we think of wood use primarily for industrial use. So making lumber, furniture, paper, so secondary products from harvested wood. That would be industrial wood that's processed into something else. But that's only worldwide, only about 50% of wood use. 50% of wood use in the world is due to domestic, which is basically use of wood for heating and for cooking. That's an important use worldwide. In developed countries, about 80% of wood is used for industrial purposes, which is why that's sort of how we probably naturally think of it. But in countries that are still developing economies, 80% of wood consumption is for domestic use. So use of wood for heating and cooking, super important. There are many products that are made out of wood. We'll talk about those in a little bit. So we've had some challenges with regard to meeting the global demand for wood. There's a number of things going on that are important. The world's population is going up every year. I already mentioned the demand for wood is going up, both due to more people. More people equals more demand, but also more development. So as economies become more developed, they tend to become more, they tend to use more wood. At the same time, we've already talked about some statistics which show that the area of the world's forest, on average, is shrinking. Now that's true mainly in Africa and South America. And this is, expressed globally with this statistic, which shows the number of acres of forest per person across the globe. And what you can see is that has been declining over time because the denominator, the number of people in the world, is going up. and the numerator, the amount of forest in the world, has been going down. So the number of acres per person available for wood has gone down steadily over the last 50 years due to those two things changing. So that's a challenge. Increasing demand for wood, less area of forests. How do we meet that demand for wood? And the case that I will make, which people argue with, but the case that I will make is that an important way that we can do this is through planted forests. Planted forests tend to be more productive. We can get many more, much more productivity, much greater amounts of wood through carefully managed planted forests than we can from harvesting natural or naturally regenerated forests. It's much like, for instance, food agriculture is an improvement over hunter-gathering societies. Planted forests are much more productive. So that really is a really important strategy, is that we can concentrate the production of wood and our use of wood products from planted forests. That then takes a lot of the pressure off the larger acreage of natural or naturally regenerated forests across the globe. So I think that's a really important strategy. And we have a lot of things, a lot of needs that can be met from forest products. So this is just a sampling of forest products. Some of them more obvious than others. So for instance, this is paper in a filter. We get paper obviously from wood. We get the fluff in diapers from wood. But some things are less obvious. So sausage casings are derived from cellulose. Thickening agents add texture and viscosity, and those often come from cellulose derivatives. Smartphone screens, again, are cellulose and other chemical derivatives. So huge number of products that we get from forests. Those products I mentioned earlier, come from harvesting trees and taking them to processing facilities and producing products. But there's lots of non-timber forest products. So these are usually foods that are derived from trees, like fruits, or spices, or chemicals that are derived from trees or other plants in the forest. So dyes, turpentine, latex can be harvested from trees, and then lots of other things that can come from both trees and other plants in the forest. So there's 150 non-timber forest products that are traded globally. So huge variety of non-timber forest products. We already mentioned the importance of domestic use of wood. So 10% of the world's population uses wood to make water safe to drink. I already mentioned that 50% of global wood consumption is for fuel for heating and cooking. 90% of all wood harvested in Africa is for domestic use. This isn't necessarily a good thing. Many people die prematurely every year because using wood for heating and cooking is not healthy. Open wood fires produce a lot of smoke and chemicals that isn't great for our respiratory systems. There are efforts to, for instance, introduce more efficient wood stoves to countries that use wood for cooking and heating, and that can certainly help. But obviously conversion eventually of those economies to other renewable sources of energy for heating and cooking is potentially useful as well. Not all wood that's used for heating is sort of that domestic type, so there are industrial wood pellets that are produced in many places, including US, Canada, and Russia, and exported elsewhere for burning for instance, municipal power generation. This is a whole thing. There's a whole literature out there helping us understand the economies of wood pellets. Wood pellet production is controversial in some places, and the demand, for instance, in Europe is driven primarily by European requirements that some fraction of electrical production be driven by renewable sources of energy, which in this case is wood, produced in the United States and then shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe. So it's a pretty complicated geopolitical system surrounding wood pellets. And then ecosystem services. This is just one slide, but ecosystem services are huge. 60 to 80% of the world's water comes from forested watersheds. So water, super important. 40% of the terrestrial carbon is in forests. And 60 to 80% of all terrestrial plant and animal species live in forests. Ecotourism, also super important. 10% of the world's tourism is ecotourism, often associated with forests. So you can take whole classes on ecosystem services, but I just want to mention here that that's a whole class of forest use that's really important. And then finally, we can't forget that a large number of people, 350 million people, that's about equivalent to the United States population. 350 million people globally live in forests and are dependent on forests for a place to live, their livelihood. They get materials for medicine and construction, fodder to feed their animals from the forest. And we need to keep that in mind when we're thinking about global uses of forests. So this whole lecture really intended primarily for people in the United States to broaden their minds and to keep in mind the global context for forests, and that is out there, and that it's very diverse, and that we need to keep that in mind because we live in a global ecosystem and in a global economy.